Hey everybody, this is Cody and Jake from Firstloop back with a behind the scenes demo of some experimental projects that we are working on. These are all about bringing you through our thought process, bringing you to the cutting edge of what you can do with AI agents. This is all about showing you the cutting edge and how we are using it for our internal tooling and products that we're working on and bringing it to our clients. My name is Jake. I'm the CEO of Firstloop. Firstloop is an AI first software development agency and product studio. And I am joined today by Cody, the CTO of Firstloop, who will be guiding us through this Claude Code test runner that he's been working on. All right, with that, I'll kick over to you, Cody, and lead us through.
Cool. Yeah. So essentially, what we've been doing is using Claude Code to run through a bunch of end-to-end tests automatically. How this works is we just provide natural language steps for Claude Code to execute on, and it uses the Playwright MCP to run through all those steps. Much like if you've used Claude Code yourself, it's got access to a to-do tool where it will maintain kind of its overall goals for the session. We have a version of that running inside of this test runner for these specific test steps. So as it's going along, it will update the status of each of those steps and either acknowledge the success or failure as it moves along.
Before we jump into the demo and the test, could you zoom out a little bit, Cody, and explain to me how you have used tools or vendors like this previously, and kind of where the need for this type of testing comes from?
Yeah, so previously in my career, I worked at a very large enterprise. If you dig into my history, you can figure out which company that is pretty quickly. But we definitely invested a lot in testing, and that included both automated end-to-end testing as well as manual end-to-end testing. And so there's kind of pros and cons to both of the traditional strategies there. So in terms of traditional end-to-end automated testing, you're kind of limited in terms of the robustness of the tests. So if you can imagine, an end-to-end test usually incorporates a pretty complex environment. Maybe there's multiple services at play. Especially at this company, we had a microservice architecture with hundreds, probably thousands of microservices. So there's just a lot that could potentially go wrong, or little network blips that could happen, or maybe an event got sent somewhere and it took a second to process. And all of this stuff would just kind of trip up the automated end-to-end tests. So that was something we struggled with a lot. We really relied on them to actually give us solid end-to-end validation, but they had that flakiness issue. And they were also just very hard to write in the first place. If you could imagine, a true production environment, writing test infrastructure that can actually navigate through all those different layers effectively and do the validation is quite tricky. On the other side, the manual end-to-end test, we actually had vendors that we would hire to essentially go step by step through natural language tests, where we had set up test accounts for them with all the appropriate configurations. And they were generally able to test far more complicated scenarios.
And so that's like them clicking through the app then.
Exactly. So essentially, we just had a test suite defined that was literally steps written in English that they would just go through and do, much like our Claude Code test runner here, and go through and check them off, and also just flag random issues that they would encounter that maybe had nothing to do with the test case. So it's kind of a cool side effect of having a real human doing that testing. The real only downside we had with the vendor tests is that you're kind of constrained by budget, but also just headcount. So I think we had three external vendors or so that we would actually pay to run through some of these tests for us, and to actually do them more than a couple of times a month, because these are vendors, they obviously have other clients too. And so you could pay to go to the front of their queue, but at the end of the day, they still have limited headcount.
Hmm.
So if we had to rush out a release, or if we had to do some last minute revalidation of specific scenarios, we either had to run those manual tests ourselves as the engineers, or wait for the vendors to be able to run them. And so, that could take, it depends on what their capacity looked like, but could take anywhere from, well, they were in a different time zone. I think I can't remember if they were in China or India. So it was pretty much guaranteed going to be by the earliest the next day before you'd see test results. So, but it would generally be longer than that unless you ask them to truncate the test suite to focus on specific cases you were worried about. So, in theory, this test runner slots somewhere in between those two. I don't think it's a full replacement for either. You could imagine just chatting with Claude Code. If you have experience doing that, it's not super fast on the back and forth. So if we're using Claude Code to instrument a browser through the Playwright MCP, it's going to take a while to actually perform
Yeah.
some fairly simple steps. Whereas, if you have a mature product and it's relatively stable, you can really just it's worth just spending the time to write some end-to-end automated tests, and those can just run, probably 10 times, 20 times faster, depending on the exact automation framework you're using. The benefits to Claude Code is that we can deal with some flakiness or some hiccups in the test.
It's like a little more robust out of the box.
Exactly. However, they're still not as robust as a real human who has context on the software. So you can trust that Claude Code is going to do the right thing. You probably still want to check in on it from time to time. And something that I still think is totally worthwhile is investing in that final end-to-end test run using a real human
Yeah.
before, especially if you have a large number of users. You definitely don't want to rely entirely on Claude Code. As folks have probably seen, Claude Code does like to just mark things as to do or defer them, even when it's updating its checklist of items to do. So, there's no way to fully prevent that from happening in this test runner either. So it's really kind of additive, fills this kind of empty space where we can do things like normal humans with this test runner. We can do them at a much larger scale, but still not fully to the quality of a human where we could necessarily just replace them. But yeah.
Great. Yeah, that's some really helpful background context. You want to walk us through how it works and show us a demo?
Yeah. So I've got my screen open here. So I think we'll just start with the demo. So I've got these demo tests here. We've got 3 of them. I've inlined a password here. I'm going to change that before this actually airs, so
Love
don't
that.
try any funny business. Anyway, so we're essentially just running through some pretty simple test cases here just to demonstrate what Claude is able to do based on natural language instructions. So the first is pretty easy. We're just navigating to one of our clients' apps staging environments and then signing in with an account and verifying that that actually succeeded, and we can see the dashboard. For the second test case, we're just going to go through a simple flow where we create a template within the app, add some fields and instructions, and finally, we've got the logout test case. So this actually all runs just as a CLI. So I've got that built up here. This library is open source. Or this repo is open source, so you can go ahead and build this yourself. We also ship it in a Docker container, which I'll get to later. But essentially, you end up with this CLI tool with a few options that you can pass in. So in this case, we're just pointing to that JSON file with our test defined. And then we're telling it where to stick the results for the test. And then we're enabling verbose logging. And I've actually configured this to use the Claude 3.5 Haiku model, which actually does pretty well for these test cases. It doesn't require a lot of thinking, and I haven't actually seen this trip up yet, but it's just a little bit faster on those back and forths when it's making tool calls and assessing the results of its actions in that MCP, or the Playwright MCP. So we'll go ahead and kick this off. And I enabled verbose logging, so we're actually going to get the full conversation happening. But you can see it's already made the MCP call to start up a browser. and navigate to the specific URL. Now it's going to go through the whole flow of signing in with that test account.
And so the logs that are outputting right there, that's the Claude Code logs then?
Exactly. This is just the specific messages, like verbatim, that are coming out of Claude Code. So if we go into this start test file, we can actually see where this is happening. So query is just, this behaves a lot like if you were just typing something into the Claude Code CLI, except we've hard coded the prompt, we've overridden the system prompt with a custom one of our own. We've pre-configured all of these MCP servers for Playwright and our own test state, pre-authorized tools. But in many ways, it's the same. So we're just calling this start test, and then maybe it's an index here. Yeah, you can see here, we're just logging those messages out just for, there's really no reason other than to dig back in the logs to see maybe if there was some issue that Claude hit. Let's
Yeah, it did. It looked
see.
like it got stuck on the sign and it tried to log in and then it gave the password as the email.
Who did it?
Yeah. I think it did the email first and then I don't know if it got redirected back to the sign in.
Well, let's try this again. Sometimes you do have to be a little bit more specific here. I've never actually seen that specific failure, so we'll try this again and just see what happens. So
Yeah,
that was
classic
I
case of
think,
live demo, huh?
yeah. But as you can kind of tell from these test steps, I was pretty lazy about how Claude should actually go about signing in. Saying navigate to staging, enter email address, it's inferring that it has to click sign in and input into this
Interesting.
specific field. So we'll see if it likes that click continue instruction.
Wow. And what I think was pretty amazing is like you just updated the test description and the instructions what to do by just editing the text in that JSON file, huh?
Right. Okay. Looks like we made it in this time. And it's probably going to load for a second because the staging environment spins up dynamically when there's no one else using it. So we'll give that a second here, but it's just going to see that it's in the dashboard and pass that test.
What just happened there? Did it closed the browser because that test was done?
Exactly. So it will restart. We use a new Claude Code instance for every test, and some of the browser state is preserved. That's a potential area for improvement of just being able to run these test cases with potentially fresh browser state. In this case, we actually want the login test case to run first so that we get the login credentials in the browser. That's not necessarily what we want to do
Yeah.
long term. But yeah, I think it might have failed the case for test creating a new template. Again, it's probably because I've just underspecified some of this and I'm using the Haiku 3.5 model, but it did successfully go through the login and log out test cases. If we actually look in here, and we've also got this results folder, which has a summary of the test cases.
And so that's a summary that the Claude instances are writing out, or is that
Right. So this actually happens. This is in Claude Code specifically. We're using an open source test format. It's called the Common Test Reporting Format. So this is all programmatically happening after the test run executes.
hmm,
So essentially, we've got the state server that's maintaining state for all of these steps in each test case, and that MCP server gets updated with the state. When the test run completes, we pull that state programmatically after Claude Code exits, and we look through all the steps, make sure that Claude successfully act them, and then then we generate this test results thing programmatically. I'm not sure if this might be a stale one. Should be going to temp results. So maybe I was just talking while this test was running, but it did act that it did all these steps. Probably worth going back and seeing if it actually did. 25 seconds was pretty fast to accomplish all that. So that's again why we don't fully trust the system without having some vendors or just engineers doing some final end-to-end testing, this will go ahead and attempt to capture failures and issues ahead of time, but it's not foolproof by any means.
Yeah, and this is like a pretty light prototype, right? Like there's probably
Right,
an order of magnitude improvements that you could layer into this if you were to build it out a little more
exactly.
robustly.
I mean, this is about like a 1 day project that you're seeing. So there's definitely tuning on the system prompt side, and again, just being more specific with some of these instructions. I'm saying navigate to the dashboard link, create a new template, fill in the instructions for the template. These are very basic instructions that it's not too surprising that Haiku 3.5 is kind of choking on a little bit, but Sonnet, you know, we can just kind of let this run in the background
Yeah.
and just see what it does. But it generally moves a bit slower, but can follow or interpret some of the nuance a bit more. So, for example, there was one time I was running this where the user was already signed in to the staging environment and we were testing the login case. And so Claude went ahead and just performed the sign out without any instructions so that it could run through the test case. So it almost like cleaned up the test state in the environment for itself so that it could unblock the test, which was quite interesting. There's no instructions obviously here that indicate it should have done that. But now I'm kind of curious to see if it will actually go through the create template test case here. And while that's running, we can also pull up the architecture diagram just so that we can jump through some of that. I realize this is pretty small. Close this guy. Maybe not. All right, we'll just let this test case run first and see what happens. Hopefully, Claude Code or Claude Sonnet, I believe 4 is the default here, but we'll see if it goes through some of this setup.
Yeah, now it's doing the new template one. I think if it makes it through this at all, I'd be pretty impressed because like you have to click to the templates page from here, then you have to click the create,
Yep.
and then you have to fill in a whole modal.
So it looks like it's getting started. I realized I had to click the templates page. And again, if we go back to this test case, the steps are navigate to the dashboard, create a new template. So it just is inferring that it needs to click that button in the top right corner based on context and then fill out that modal. It's not going to populate this template with anything particularly good or interesting, but now it's going down, clearly navigating to the instructions section and filled that out.
Wow. So when you have the Playwright MCP controlling a browser like that, does it respect the size of the browser window? Like you have it pretty small here. So does Claude need to scroll and execute a scroll command?
I assume yes. And it's not exposed through uh, our tool just yet, but Playwright also allows you to mock the screen size of specific devices. So you could say, run this like it's an iPhone 14, and it will actually run it in the profile. So I assume that it is not just seeing necessarily like the full HTML. I think it actually gets my understanding is that it gets an accessibility snapshot
Yep.
of what the screen includes. So, I don't think it's necessarily able to see hidden fields or anything like that, or at least what isn't able to interact with them. So it very much, I think, gets the view we're seeing through the browser. And there you saw it had to actually save the field updates for it to persist, and it even went through that.
Yeah.
So something definitely happened on that Haiku run. So, this isn't horribly slow in comparison. It's probably going to take about twice as long to run through this, and maybe with some extra tuning, Haiku would do a bit better. It handled the login and logout test cases fine, so it's probably a consequence of the underspecified steps why it wasn't able to do that second test case
Yeah.
reliably.
And that's something that you've mentioned and want to circle back on is the ambient agent idea. And if this was deployed as a GitHub action, the total time to run the test matters a whole lot less besides like your
Right.
GitHub action minutes. But, it's probably pretty rare that once you have the setup, you're not going to be sitting here watching it run through the test like we are right now.
Exactly. Yeah, when this is just running in a GitHub action, it could take, ideally you're not just wasting your GitHub action minutes and tokens, just letting this run kind of rampant and do whatever it wants and go for an hour to run 3 tests. But definitely a minute per test is pretty reasonable. Depending on your end-to-end automation is, potentially comparable. I've seen some pretty slow, traditionally automated end-to-end tests that take a long time to initialize the environment and
Hmm.
perform actions because of various things under the hood that we don't need to get into here. But depending on the actual test framework, it can still be pretty slow to run some of these. But yeah, let's jump into that architecture diagram just to get into some of the guts of that. So the actual setup for this is relatively straightforward. So I've tried to go ahead and use mermaid diagrams here just so that this is available in the README on the GitHub repo if folks want to check it out there. But I've kind of separated this in a few ways. So there's 2 outlining boxes. We've got the actual CLI, which is our tool that we ship. And then we've got the hosts surrounding the CLI, which includes that Playwright MCP and the Sandbox Chrome browser, which clearly runs in a separate process. So this all runs on either your personal machine if you're doing a local test run like we just demonstrated, or it could also run in a GitHub action. And again, we'll get into that a little bit later. But essentially, our CLI is comprised of a few things. We've got the actual test runner logic, which is just all of the logic, which kind of loops over the test cases and parses those out, and then invokes the Claude Code SDK with the details there. So essentially, how a test case works is that test runner starts up, it will post the steps over to this custom state MCP server. This is an MCP server that we own. This is a local HTTP server that just exposes the tool for
Hmm.
getting the current state of the test and updating a specific step of the test. So Claude Code is going to use those to first discover all the steps it needs to perform, and then actually iterate through them and update them in sequence. And so we require Claude Code to actually call update with an explicit status for each of those steps in order to consider a step passed. And of course, there's nothing to stop Claude from just lying and updating all those fields, but it does need to make a concrete MCP call for every single step in the test with an explicit status. So essentially, we do that initialization of this MCP server locally, and then we start the test run with just those generic system instructions. And that's when Claude Code just kind of takes over. It's going to, like I said, read into that MCP server to get the state of the steps. It's then going to go through those sequentially, making MCP calls to the Playwright MCP, and then obviously talking with the Anthropic backend services to exchange messages. We're not doing any inference locally. This is just normal Claude Code style. And so it essentially is just running in a loop of these, working with Anthropic to figure out the MCP tools to call, and then making those calls and just going in a loop until it either gives up or runs out of, I think we allow it to take by default like 30 steps. And that's
Hmm.
a configurable parameter on the CLI if you've got a really complicated test setup. And so it will either go until it runs out of steps or just gives up on its own, or the test is satisfied and all those steps are marked as succeeded.
Did you run into many of those of Claude Code giving up and like not completing the test end to end?
No, it usually would just keep going. And maybe there was a few where I gave it like the incorrect password for the account and it would just sign in. And in that case, I think it interpreted pretty quickly that it wasn't going to be able to
Yep.
finish the test because it didn't have the proper credentials. So I think it'll give up in those cases where there's a very clear failure path. But if it's just like under specified steps, it will kind of try to explore around and figure
Hmm.
out what to do, sometimes incorrectly. And in that case, it kind of just will run into the step limit in my case. And, 30 steps, that's not a huge amount to just let it go off and explore and do things. So, if that was increased to 100, maybe it would actually give up earlier rather than just kind of hitting that timeout. But,
Yep.
that's something that anyone who uses this library will just kind of have to tune for themselves if they've got those really complex tests, or maybe their tests should only require 10 steps. And if Claude goes anything beyond that, they want it to fail. And so you can configure that lower threshold as well.
I think one interesting observation on that, sorry to interrupt, is just the using, I keep thinking the comparison between using the Vercel AI SDK and having it work with MCP tools and kind of do this loop directly. Like it's almost like a more low level control versus the Claude
Hmm.
Code SDK is kind of like a whole agent in a box. And I'm really bullish on Claude Code. Like it just feels really good. Like the agent harness and the model work really well together. You could create this whole thing using AI SDK and have a GPT-5 or a Gemini model in there. But it kind of feels like it's worth it to use Claude Code. Like you just get so much and it works so nicely. And I don't know why, but I just kind of like trust Claude Code. Like I feel like it'll do the right thing. Like it'll either stop the test run early if it's impossible, or it'll, continue as much as reasonable. And maybe that's just placebo or bias from like having so much time interacting with Claude Code locally. Right now, I think it just has limitations on kind of some of the like built-in telemetry, and like the SDK is good enough, but I feel like it's not quite everything you would want to use it like as a single unit of compute. Maybe the most comparable thing is the OpenAI responses API, which I haven't had the chance to explore as much with. But I just wonder if Anthropic is eventually going to offer Claude Code as a API as well.
Mm.
Or is it always going to be like a process you have to kind of like run locally like this? Or are they going to make like a little bit more of an abstraction around it? But either way, just interesting that you get so much utility out of the Claude Code, like just packaged by itself.
Right. Yeah. Just in terms of like even just starting MCP servers, if you look back at this config, let's see. We're really just in the case of the state server where we're maintaining all that test state, we do have to initialize the server on our own. But in terms of like all of the setup for this, for example, Cloud Code is really convenient because it's spinning these up. It's doing the tool discovery for us
Yep.
out of the gate. It really is just in terms of setting up the environment and then maintaining that kind of extended loop of going after a task, and it does just feel very smooth compared to what we would have to do on if we were using an OpenAI API directly. And there's also the added benefit here of being able to use OAuth tokens for
Hmm.
running this, even in GitHub Actions. There's no need to use an API key and incur all those costs. Because if you actually dig in, I think you can see in our terminal here what we log the final result message here, and that actually includes the cost. So you can see like, $1.16 to run that. And, maybe that's justified, especially if these are just running a couple of times per day and you're a very large company. But in terms of actually running this stuff and paying the full cost of the inference as if you were going through an API, it's going to get expensive because dumping, for example, the full accessibility state of a screen
Yep.
every time you need to do an action and passing that into Claude Code is going to use a lot of tokens. And that's also an added benefit. And that's not necessarily a long-term benefit, but something we can take advantage of in the short term while there's so much subsidization of these tools happening, and maybe this
Yeah.
gets to a point where it's actually going to be a lot cheaper in the future anyways. But something to consider with with these tools, especially if you run them in the cloud, is you can't always take advantage of your personal subscriptions and OAuth tokens. You're probably going to be paying whatever the API metered fee is for tokens out of this.
Yeah. Love the being able to spread the costs like that. Like you get to pay a fixed price and then use up a bunch of variable cost. Like you could easily get your value out of the subscription just by having these test runners run across a few projects or a number of other tests.
Exactly.
All right, what do you want to show us next? Are we going to look at the GitHub action or?
Yeah, I'm just gonna quick go through the actual YAML here just to avoid going into our client's repo on the recording. The actual setup for this is pretty straightforward. So we actually just ship this as a Docker container, and we're publishing it to the GitHub container registry just publicly. So really anybody can go pull that container down. It's got all of the essentials for running this tool. It's got Playwright pre-installed, Claude Code pre-installed. So really all you have to do is point your job at this specific image, and you can pull your repo down. If you have any concerns about security, which you shouldn't because this is all open source, you can look in there yourself. But you can sync the specific files when you do the checkout just to include your tests, and you can just essentially call that CLI. And eventually maybe we'll create some sort of custom action here that abstracts a lot of this away, and you can just extend off the action and pass in specific
Hmm.
parameters. But for now, I mean, it's a 42 lines of YAML to actually make this possible. The only thing I'll call out is the specific piece. So in order to do this, I'm sure folks have seen, you can, in the Claude Code CLI, there is a slash command for uh, something about linking to GitHub. I can't remember the exact phrasing of it, but it's basically like set up in GitHub.
Yeah,
And
install a
so you can
GitHub
just
app.
install a GitHub app. So you can essentially just run that, and that will go ahead, and if you point it at the correct repository, the secret's just going to be available for you. And the CLI handles all that setup. And you'll probably want to do this anyways, because that's how you can set up the Claude Code pull request reviewer, as well as just the SWE agent that you can assign issues to open PRs against. So this uses that same OAuth token. But yeah, that's pretty much it from the implementation side of things.
One last question on the GitHub action. The one thing that I was curious about is you can actually run those actions as cron jobs then?
Right. This one doesn't show it.
Okay.
You can specify a trigger up here, and there's all sorts of triggers you can use for GitHub Actions. It's worth browsing them just to see which ones apply to you. But you can create actions for, maybe you tag a branch. Maybe that's like your branching strategy is you ship some sort of library and you tag a branch with the new release version. You could have this automatically queue off
Yeah.
of creating that tag, or you could have it run nightly, or you could have it run every time a commit gets merged to main. There's all sorts of different configuration options. And that's kind of where the ambient aspect of this comes in, is that we're more or less decoupling this agent from us. We might check in on it every once in a while just to make sure it's doing what we want, and we'll be reviewing the test results specifically for failures. But otherwise, once this is set up, we're not really running it locally on any regular cadence. This is kind of just going off and doing its own thing, and we're being alerted to its results via the GitHub UI. Sweet. So that's kind of the implementation. I guess we could ponder a bit about what this looks like for us going forward, how we'll be taking advantage of this, and how potentially we could see other teams like us, or even some of those larger teams, taking advantage of it too.
Yeah, what's your first thought there?
I see us using this for pretty much every client project that we bring online. So for folks who don't know, we particularly specialize in greenfield projects or prototype projects that are moving extremely fast because we're essentially using agents everywhere possible to generate code and validate code and ship it. It becomes pretty hard to maintain even just unit tests, let alone end-to-end tests that aren't just going to break every single day because we moved a button somewhere or we slightly changed a page around or we nested something in a different part of an application of the application. So I think that this will be something we set up almost immediately. Once a staging environment is deployed for our clients, we're pretty much going to have this running through some of those core scenarios out of the gate, just so that we can really get that fast feedback without spending a bunch of time on tests. And we can make sure that all the core flows in the app aren't being broken accidentally as we're checking in sometimes a dozen PRs a day each, it feels
Yeah.
like, on some of these projects. So, especially having this run overnight, if we ship a wave of PRs and then we can sign on the next morning, hopefully be alerted to anything that we potentially broke so that we can get on that before we move on to the next wave of features.
Two yes adds to that is like the resilience of the agent is really nice because sometimes, especially early on in a project where we're iterating through the design really quickly, like the whole UI might change in a PR, and these tests would be relatively resilient to that, which I think is pretty neat. The next thing is what you just said made me think of it of, have them run overnight and might surface some issues, but the agents in a future version could just open up issues to then fix those issues. Like we could have this, give it the GitHub MCP and just give it permissions to create issues and tag Claude in it. And if there was an issue somewhere where a page didn't load, it could just say, hey, I ran into this. Here's the screenshot, tag Claude. And in addition to this, the bug being identified, we might have a PR open for us to review the next morning as well.
I think I know what I'm working on when we wrap up this call. Yeah, it's
That's cool.
funny. I was just working on another agent for a related video that uses the GitHub MCP just to create change log or update a change log based on the day's commits. And so it doesn't seem like that crazy of a lift to connect the GitHub MCP into the inner loop even of these tests. And that way, we can also have Claude Code potentially describe in more detail what the actual issue is and maybe point at some specific components when it's creating that issue. And also, I think probably upload screenshots. I
Yeah.
imagine it can do quite a few different things there from the inner loop while it's got full access to the application still. Maybe there's also dumping console logs. I don't really know what the limits are there. So definitely worth checking out and makes this an even more
Huh.
compelling agent setup.
Yeah, the you mentioned like console logs. I know Bun, their like full stack approach ships with this. I think Next.js has adopted it now too, where you can pass in a flag when you're running the application, and console logs will stream to like the server as well, just with like a bracket prefix in front that says it's from the browser. And so I wonder if we look at including some of that as well. Like we just get the browser information back into the server, maybe like a little more accessible way.
Yeah.
But I guess you can just pull it out with Playwright too. You can just pull the console logs through Playwright, so that might be more direct.
Yeah, we'd have to look at the full limitations. I mean, if you look at the MCP tools that are available here, there's quite a few. And I believe this is a short list even.
Yep.
So there's console messages.
Oh,
So
yep.
probably can't just pull those out.
Yeah, you're
But
right.
you're likely going to want the server messages anyways. Maybe combining those all on the back end isn't necessarily a bad thing, especially in a staging environment where we know if we ever do go in to look at those logs that we're potentially going to want both the back end and front end logs kind of side by side to avoid a
Yeah.
specific issue. But yeah, very cool ideas there. I definitely like expanding the capabilities, especially the inner loop here, of just giving this agent the ability to create GitHub issues and assign them out feels huge. And kind of a yes and to that as well is you can kind of start to imagine going in an even more abstract direction with that, where at a certain point, do we even need to define test cases, or could we just have, I think there's different versions of this already that aren't AI
Hmm.
powered that are called, I think it's called like Monkey Tool on Android, where it essentially just goes into your app and hammers around and tries to break things.
Yeah, it's like the chaos monkey idea.
Exactly. But those are running, those traditional tools are running without any intelligence built in. So they're just kind of pressing buttons and clicking things and seeing if it can break stuff that way. It's a lot more algorithmic, I guess. So with Claude, it can actually, maybe we just tell it what this app can do at a high level,
Yeah,
and it can just try to go do things. And if it runs into an error that's unexpected because maybe we aren't sanitizing an input somewhere and it put in an invalid value, it could just discover that stuff organically, potentially, if we just give it kind of the high level synopsis or maybe even public documentation for those apps that are mature enough to have
yeah,
such a thing.
yeah. I really like that idea. Excuse me. Yeah, you could have it the high level description and give it somewhere to persist notes between runs. So that way, if it goes down a certain path, like you can say, "Oh, I found a bug here. I should probably check this on a regular basis." That could get to some of the like building the knowledge out over time as well.
Cool. Yeah, another project for the backlog there.
Yeah,
I think that could be, I mean, that could just be a flag that we pass into this specific tool of, rather than passing in test cases, we're just going to pass in that high level synopsis of the app you're going to access with the credentials and just kind of let it go do its thing. Maybe we let it do 10 runs where it just gets 50 steps per run. It can just go off and explore.
yeah. I really enjoy that GitHub Actions or that Claude Code prioritized GitHub Actions. Like the fact that it's based on just or works so nicely with existing software development primitives. And like this could be like a whole SaaS app by itself, but it's just a Docker container and a YAML file and a little bit of configuration, and the possibilities are now endless. Like I think the design principles that the Anthropic team brought to the table with Claude Code is really nice.
Totally. And as you can imagine, being able to just write source code around the Claude Code SDK and write your own pipelines, like I fully agree. The possibilities are limitless. Anything that somebody's doing in a GitHub action right now can only be, you can only build on top of that and start to imagine what you can do with a little, even just a little bit of intelligence. We're running through predefined test cases here. That's, it requires some level of intelligence, but it's nothing like generating architecture plans or writing very complicated code or doing a crazy refactor and needing to reason through all of that and understand the implications of every single line of code that's changed. So, it feels like we're just barely tapping into what Claude Code is capable of with
Yo,
this, and it already feels extremely powerful.
yeah.
All
Well,
right.
yeah. Anything else that you want to show us? Anything else on the mind here?
No, I think that'll wrap it up for this week. So, yeah, thanks everyone for joining us. We're going to try to do one of these per week and hopefully come with something fresh each week. But until next time, this is Jake and Cody signing off.
All right, we'll see
Bye
you
bye.
then. Bye.